Okay, so this session is integrating an EDI strategy for action and accountability. And just want to acknowledge that the land that we're gathered on before we get started. So we're on Treaty 7 territory in the homeland of the Métis. And today's discussion and the work that Courtney and I do to help make workplaces, work culture work better for everyone. As non-Indigenous people, we really strive to support and be allies and work to make workplaces inclusive for Indigenous people as well. So we really believe that advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, it has to be done alongside truth and reconciliation. So even though we might not have it on all the slides, it's top of mind as we're doing this work. It's important to be doing this work alongside that. So here's us. We'll get into a short introduction here about each of us. Okay, so first me, I am a professional mechanical engineer turned equity, diversity, and inclusion researcher. And I'm a PhD candidate as well at the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm an entrepreneur. My company's Prairie Catalyst Consulting, so we're presenting today kind of with the hats of Prairie Catalyst Consulting on. And I'm a board member with Women in Mining, Women in Nuclear Saskatchewan, and I've also been on ongoing member with advisory member with Eco Canada's Reclaiming Leadership project, which there's a really great toolkit that will bring up some points from it today too. So I'm also a mom of 2 girls. My husband's an engineer as well. And equity, diversity, inclusion is really important to me because I know what it's like to be underrepresented. I worked the first 13 years of my career in the Canadian mining industry. And in a lot of that first 13 years, I was the only woman like me in a lot of the places I was in. I was the only woman engineer in the engineering department. Often I was the only woman in the room. When I moved into a leadership role, I was one of the few people who didn't have a stay-at-home spouse to care for my 2 children. So I understand some of the challenges that can come from being the only, and that's really inspired me to do this work. So a few years ago, I left working directly in the mining industry, and I went back to school and did a master's, and now most of the way through a PhD, focused around understanding what the challenges are that underrepresented people face in workplaces, and then what can we do about it? What solutions can we implement? How can we help move the needle and speed things up? So in my business and the work that I do with Courtney, we support people and organizations to advance on their equity, diversity, and inclusion journeys. Based on kind of where they're at. And in my PhD project, my focus is around workplace allyship. So trying to draw people in that maybe aren't a part of the conversation already, and helping them understand what their roles and responsibilities, and helping them get comfortable with talking about things that maybe don't directly impact them, but indirectly impact all of us. So we will touch a little bit on allyship as we go through things too. And I'll hand over to Courtney to introduce herself.
I like that we're sharing one mic. It's really nice. It's also really nice to be up on stage here with Jocelyn. We do a lot of work virtually. We're not located in the same places, so it's quite a treat to be together in person to do the work that we often do together virtually. So I have a picture that I'll speak to last. I'll keep you guessing about the picture. So my name's Courtney Hughes. I have a background in human resources. I worked in operational HR for the first chunk of my career, and then went back to school to do a master's, sort of similar to Jocelyn. Had that not quite mid-career, but a little bit of time for transition. I've always been interested in diversity and inclusion probably before I had the language for that. I was interested in what was then business ethics, which probably some of you environmentalists have definitely taken courses in that. There was no DEI, but there was business ethics. So I studied a lot in that and was really curious, but there wasn't really any jobs. So I went into HR, and that was fine. And then later, I also am married to an engineer. So I'm always engineering adjacent, which I like. And we kind of had different career paths, but I was always really curious about women and their experiences in STEM, and particularly in engineering, and hearing from our friends and colleagues some of the challenges that they were going through. And through my work, I worked for an airline for a short time, and I was involved in hiring the first female aircraft mechanics, which was really exciting, and also really devastating because they didn't last because the culture was not ready for actually adding women at that time. So some early lessons learned. But yeah, so eventually I ended up in mining and did a similar project to Jocelyn's, sort of how we connected at different universities. But over at UBC, I was in the mining engineering department and did what was kind of, I guess, the first study at that time on gender and mining, and particularly the career progressions of women in the sector. And from that, I worked in the mining industry in kind of policy and workforce development. I worked for an organization out of Ottawa for many years, starting DEI projects, starting gender inclusion projects, and have now landed in consulting. And I'm so delighted because I think Jocelyn, our career paths have kind of passed each other for so long, and now we get to do this great work together and support organizations. I'm also on the Women in Mining board in British Columbia, and engaged in some of the work that we do out on the West Coast. And so my picture that I thought I would share today is essentially because my work now is a lot involved with ESG and DEI and how do these two things fit together, and some of the same challenges and different challenges. But I think more about my environment, and we'll talk about place and DEI later. And so I wanted to share a picture of my backyard, which looks quite clean here, not littered with children's toys, so that's good. And two of my residents. So these two bears, we've been basically following them for the last 3 years. There were 3, and now there's 2. But we're very fortunate that we live really close to a wildlife corridor just behind our place. But, you know, the impacts of environment are everywhere, and this, according to our longtime residents in the area, have told me this is the latest the bears have not hibernated ever. And speaking to one of our neighbors who's lived there for 45 years, I think she's got a pretty good history of the bear activity. So we're happy to have them, and they love playing soccer in our backyard. I'm not sure why, but they're very attracted to the soccer ball. But anyways, it's just sort of something that I noted, and just the connections to how, you know, the environment is impacting all of us in different ways. So yeah, we're really fortunate. We live on the beautiful unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, and I have these gorgeous residents that live in my backyard. Now into the important stuff.
Thanks, Courtney. So the purpose of our workshop today is to learn how an EDI strategy can be used to define the problems that you're trying to solve within your organization. As an engineer, very big on defining the problems first. So we're going to go through some of that today, and we'll go through a bit of background. On this slide, we have a brief overview of the session. So we have 3 hours. That seems like a lot of time, especially after lunch. So we're gonna take a break, but please feel free. If you need to move around, if you need to grab a drink, if you need to buy a break, please feel free. We're gonna have lots of discussion time, so we'll try to give you some mini breaks kind of throughout and try to keep you awake and entertained and engaged throughout the whole conversation. So just to get a little bit of a feel in the room, and we're going to have a few different tools that we're going to use to try to engage you in conversation. We have some worksheets that are on your table, and we're going to use some tools on the screen too. But just to get people maybe moving around after lunch, I'm going to get you all to stand up. And rather than raising hands, we'll get people to stand up and sit down. And if that doesn't work for someone, though, feel free to sit and raise your hand. Okay, so I'll get you to stay standing if you're currently responsible for leading some sort of equity, diversity, inclusion, or truth and reconciliation work, kind of in a volunteer role or within your paid job. Is anyone doing that already? Okay, there's a few people in the room that are doing some of that work. Okay, great. So look around at some of those people, and we're going to want to learn from them. And the rest of you can sit down. And if you're not doing that yet, maybe just raise hands. Who thinks they might get involved with it in the next 3 to 5 years? Yeah, so it's coming, right? If we're not doing it already, these things are coming, and we know with some of the discussions that were happening earlier this morning that, you know, regulations are coming that are maybe going to inspire it. Sometimes because it's the right thing to do, we're going to want to have some more transparency around these type of things too. So organizational strategies are essential, and I think I've heard that theme throughout a lot of the conference, especially when we're thinking about climate change and how do we impact climate change and how do we mitigate things around it. Same kind of thing when we're thinking about the social side of things and equity, diversity, inclusion too. We need to set a chart for where we want to go, even if we don't know exactly what that end destination looks like, and maybe where we're going. We never quite get there, but we keep moving further along on that journey. So we want to do this work and we want to integrate it into our current businesses, into our current organizations. It's not a separate thing that's off to the side that we're going to sometimes get to. We need to really make sure that it's integrated throughout, just like we do a lot of our different practices. And so when we're thinking about these things, we're talking about equity, diversity, inclusion, and we're going to go through what each of those terms mean and how we might measure them and how we can kind of engage in conversations and think about them. But when we're thinking about these kind of things, we're really focusing a lot on the inclusion piece and the equity piece. Those are the things that we're wanting to change first. And so we're doing those and we're thinking about how do we engage and retain a diverse and representative workforce. And so really thinking about that maybe as our goal on the horizon, that we want to get to where the places and spaces that we work and we live, where they look kind of similar, of the mix of people that we have, within our communities, or kind of the mix of people that we have within our organizations too. So that's kind of our long-term horizon goal. But we know that we don't have that right now. And we'll talk about some of those numbers today and where some of those gaps are. And we'll touch on what some of the challenges are that different groups might face as well. So as we work through this framework, we're going to leave you with some homework too. So there's going to be questions and things you maybe can't answer today in this workshop, but you could maybe take it back to your organization. You can embed some things into your own professional practice and your own professional growth plan. Okay, I didn't quite understand that. I need to do some more learning in that area. I don't quite understand the challenges maybe that this group faces that's different than me. So that might be some of your homework that you leave after the session too. And if you need idea for resources and different things like that, we can point you in directions. So we're going to share some best practices and some insights. The tool that we're going to work through today, this framework, is really good for setting up strategies. And Courtney and I we listened in on an audit and assessment assurance session this morning. So we do equity, diversity, inclusion assessments within organizations. So we go in with this framework in mind, and we ask questions, and we try to evaluate where organizations are at in terms of inclusion and equity and diversity. So we can share some examples of where we've seen organizations be really successful, where some organizations are stumbling, and some ideas on maybe how to get over those challenges and how to move forward. And we want this to be interactive and informative too, so please ask questions. We're going to wander around. We're going to give you time to talk at your table groups. If you're sitting by yourself at a table, we might make you move and sit with others because you're going to want to discuss things and share with others. If you're sitting with other people that you already work with on a regular basis, you can have some brainstorming that maybe you can take back to your organization, but encourage you to move around too and maybe learn from someone different as well. So I may be forgetting to advance slides. Okay, so participation, what does that look like today? We want you to participate to your fullest ability. Sometimes when we're talking about social issues, it can be kind of tough. And so if you need to take a break, please do that. We want to make sure that this is a safe place for learning and discussion. And if you're feeling like the topics are too heavy or it's really not working for you, please take a break and take care of yourself and take care of others around you. So other than that, we want you to participate as much as you can, and we're going to guide you through some elements that we believe are really essential components of equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies, and there's going to be opportunities to work together and ask questions. And check our assumptions too. If there's things that we don't understand, there's things we're not sure about, ask questions here or mark it down that it's maybe an area you want to do some more learning afterwards as well. And we encourage you to participate in a number of different ways, so we're going to use some different communication tools, and if it's not working, we can pivot around that too. Yeah, and last thing is just there might be things shared in this discussions today that maybe don't need to go beyond this room, so please keep things confidential too if somebody chooses to disclose something that maybe they wouldn't want others to know. Okay, Courtney, over to you.
Speaking of trying new things, we're going to try a live poll today in our workshop. So I don't know, has anyone used Mentimeter? Maybe hands up for those. So we've got some familiarity. And so this is a tool that we often use in a virtual space. We're going to try it today live. So we'll see how sweaty this makes us. So you can see the QR code there, and if that doesn't work for you, feel free to type in the address to menti.com and that specific link, and I will ask our esteemed tech team in the back, maybe in about a minute, to switch us to the other, but not yet. Okay, great. And so we're going to use Mentimeter, and for those of you that haven't used it or have some familiarity, it's a really great tool because we can basically have a whole bunch of hands up with a whole bunch of answers all at one time, and it's anonymous. So you're welcome to sort of share some points, add to the discussion from your phone or your tablet, and it will not be attributed to you specifically, but it helps to kind of build the conversation. So you'll see how that works. And we'll have a couple of different style of questions that we're going to kind of flow through into our discussions today. What we like about it is it gives us a chance to, one, kind of bring us together in the conversation quite quickly. It also creates that anonymity. And for those of you that maybe discussion isn't your favorite way to learn, this might be a great option. So we're just trying to really kind of bridge that for everyone and give a space to have those reflections. So with that, I think we can jump to the Mentimeter slide. And let's just let us know, like, are you getting to something with the QR code? Is it working? We're looking good. I'm seeing heads nodding. If not, just raise your hand. We'll come and help. Okay. And did you want to flip, sorry, tech team, to the other slide if you can, to the live stream? Actually, Jocelyn, do you want to maybe help her? And then I'll speak to it. Yeah. Awesome. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Look at that, it's already on and you're already adding to it. Fabulous. So this is our softball start here, but yeah, what are you hoping to get out of today's session? This will be sort of a nice piece for us to reflect on later. And as well, once you finish adding to the Mentimeter and you're feeling good about it, I'm going to encourage everyone to meet within their tables, those of you that are sitting by yourselves, if you want to join in, and just have a bit of a collective discussion about what you're hoping to get out of the session today. And also a little bit of a discussion about what you're currently working on around EDI, what kind of support you're looking for. If you don't have a lot of awareness in this space, just kind of sharing that so we get a bit of a sense working together. We're going to get into the strategy in a bit, but good to sort of get a sense of where we're all at. So when you finish with the Mentimeter question, you can join up in your groups and just have a quick chat about your intentions for today. And we'll give that maybe 2 minutes because we're running, I know, a little bit behind. Okay, we're going to come back to the conversation together. I see lots of good conversations happening. This is always, I don't like this part. I don't like bringing everybody back and stopping the conversation, but here we are. Thank you. So I'm so pleased everybody's kind of grouped into spaces where they can engage together, which is going to be great because as we get into the worksheet, that will be very helpful. So thank you for all trying out Mentimeter, those that are new to it, and we'll see it popping in and out through the presentation. Just wanted to touch on a few themes that I'm seeing here in some of the comments. Certainly intentions for today, a lot of interest in resources and tools and some strategy around EDI. The one that Jocelyn and I both commented on was how to sway the opinions of someone who's against it. And certainly, those are challenging conversations that we're all having, and it's not easy. I mean, we definitely have some tools and ideas, but that is a space that's constantly challenging. So You're not alone, whoever wrote that. That's an area we're always working on. But yeah, lots of interest in sort of creating that strategy and learning some new things to really bring back to your organization. So we hope that we can meet that today in the workshop. Okay, so we'll flip back to the presentation deck, please. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to do like a very quick EDI 101, as in 2 minutes. But again, so there's obviously lots to dive into here. We're going to use the terminology EDI and DEI kind of interchangeably today. There are other acronyms that you may have heard in media or in conversations. So potentially you've heard JEDI or IDEA, and so adding accessibility or justice to the terminology that we're going to speak to. Jocelyn and I do a lot of work too around intersectionality. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but certainly there are obviously other aspects to this conversation that can be included in the terminology that we've presented to you. So very briefly, as Jocelyn mentioned, diversity is really around representation. So it's often the thing that companies want to do first. They want to diversify. They want to create those numbers that sort of parity within their teams. But it's really the thing that comes last, as she mentioned. So this is the tricky part. So the measurement is the thing that always comes up first because it's the thing that we observe. So the example today in the open discussion, we're noticing there's not a lot of women in management roles in environmental professions. So there's this observation of some sort of difference, some sort of identity factor that's not there, not at the table. And so from that usually spurs some interest in the organization. Hey, we should do something about that, or let's look into that a bit more. What are the numbers? And what about this team that we have on the other side of Canada? Does it look the same there? So there's sort of this investigation that naturally starts to happen. However, to just jump in then and try to fix that representation, it often backfires. So we want to talk about sort of that, building that inclusivity, building that sense of belonging, creating spaces for equity as actually the first actions, and diversity happens alongside it. So again, diversity really about measurement. It's what we're measuring around, usually variety or identity. We'll talk about identity groups and as part of that conversation today. And inclusion is really around that acceptance into celebration. And I think about how the terminology around inclusion has changed. So if we go back, a few years, and certainly those in HR remember, the way that we described this was very different. So instead of things like acceptance and celebration, we use the word tolerance in policy, which is feels so yick in 2024, but that's the kind of language, and that's how the language is evolving, right? So we want to move beyond that into a space where people can really be themselves, and we can get to a level of performance and really sort of exceed those levels of performance by creating those spaces that are really safe for everyone to show up as they are. So that's inclusion, and I think it can be the most challenging thing to measure because it is more around sort of a feeling, a sense of oneself in a place. And there's lots of great sociologists, and Jocelyn's done great research in this too, to help build some metrics around there. And there is some good tools, but it's not as tangible as the diversity measurement. It won't be, right? So we just have to kind of accept that. For equity, this one can get tricky because we often interchange it with equality, and they're very different. So when we're talking about equity, we're really talking about an idea of fairness and really sort of providing people what they need when they need it. And equality is slightly different. So if I want to flip to the next slide, thank you. This is an updated graph. We usually have this image, but it's new. It's a little bit fresh, so it's nice to look at. But the idea here is, what is the difference between equality and equity? Equality is often around, it's around sort of resourcing. So, famously in many job postings, you'll see we're an equal opportunity employer. We provide equal opportunities. We provide equal opportunities to training or advancement or whatever the terminology may be, to entice this idea of hey, it's a welcoming place to be. And the challenge with equality as the focus is it really looks at giving everybody the same thing. And as you can see in the picture here, that doesn't quite work when we're looking at performance. So we've got 3 different sort of needs levels, and when they've all been given the same resource, and you see the outcomes. And one person that's able to perform, while the other 2 are not able to even access to perform because the resource is inadequate or doesn't fit for them. And so with equity, it's a little bit trickier because we actually have to get to know people. We get to know their individual needs or their group needs and provide resources, provide tools that fit those needs so they're able to perform. So we're really getting to outcome. We want equality in the outcome with equity. That's really confusing, but maybe you'll get there. I don't know, maybe I'll get there. Where equity is really that space to really listen, to get to know what people need and providing them with those resources. I think it's done best in the picture, right? Which is nice. Okay, so we're gonna jump back to our Mentimeter and thinking about some of that language that we just sort of went over. And you should be, if you're already there on your phone, you actually should be able to move to the next question. So if that's happening, you might not have to take the picture again. But again, put up your hands if it's not working and we'll figure it out. So this next question is really around a reflection on your own career. And have you witnessed or experienced some of these equity, an equity-facing challenge in your career? And again, it could be something that you personally experienced or something that you've witnessed someone else experience. And we'll just take a couple minutes and pause there. And then if we want to flip to the Mentimeter, is everyone accessing the question okay? Is it good? Okay. Waiting to load? Okay. Okay. I think it might have just been moved now. Let me know. No, still? Okay. Do you want to just refresh? Yeah, does it work? If you refresh it? Okay. I love using technology live. This is like very much what my nightmares are made of. Okay, great. So we're starting to see some of the answers rolling in, and certainly I don't think there's any surprises here. I think if you asked anyone in any profession, they've probably experienced or witnessed some of these challenges that you're seeing here. So certainly looking at some of those diversity observations, so the one around sort of senior management, mostly male, and so that's sort of a piece. We often talk to organizations where they're looking to increase sort of the pipeline for Indigenous folks into management and senior leadership, so similar observations that are made. Social activities that favor childless staff. So I know Jocelyn, I can tell you many mining stories that relate very much to that example. Many golf tournaments, many golf tournaments. So there's really good examples of those inclusive pieces, right? How we build our team, how do we connect people? We have social activities, we have these sort of team building things that are light, that create those connections, that enable us to work better and perform better, and have those more innovative conversations. Well, if it's not a place that I can show up because I don't have childcare, then I'm not able to access those opportunities. So that's a really good one as well. Discussions around discrimination, pay equity is a huge piece right now. There's a lot of organizations that are digging into this, doing some auditing work and assessment. So certainly, again, those are sort of common themes we're seeing. Discussions around intersectionality here, so being women and persons of color, and long tenured employees. Lots more work now, certainly in our space, around kind of age and ageism within different careers, and connecting sort of different generations and noticing some of those differences in style and learnings, and really creating spaces where everybody can participate, despite that as kind of an identity piece. Language barrier, maternity leave, we heard a lot about that today in the women's focused discussion earlier on, and disability as well. Yeah, and so again, around sort of advancement to promotion, access to training, those are all areas that we often see that there's barriers or challenges around equity. So all things that can be perhaps not remedied, but supported by really good diversity inclusion strategy and good buy-in in your organization, which we'll get into in the next little bit.
Thanks, Courtney. Okay, if we can switch back just to our slides, please. Okay. So why EDI? So just to kind of summarize a few things and what's happening within the environmental sector and why it's important here. we just have some data here that we're going to talk about from Eco-Canada, from a 2022 workforce diversity series that they did. So not a big surprise maybe, women are about 50% of the population in Canada, but we can see that they're underrepresented in the environmental sector. So only about 38% of the sector. Indigenous people are about 5% of the population within Canada and about 5% of the environmental sector. So I think that's kind of interesting. My next question around that usually is, okay, you know, that looks pretty good, but do we have, you know, half of that 5%, are they women, half are they men roughly? If not, then maybe there's some more work to do there too. And that might vary a lot across Canada too. So in Saskatchewan, where I'm from, 16% of the population is Indigenous. So, you know, I would want to see that number a lot higher in Saskatchewan. I'm not sure what it is, but visible minorities are just over 26% of the population in Canada, and only 6% of the environmental sector. So that shows quite a bit of underrepresentation there as well. And that's kind of looking at Canada as a whole too. Like if we see that there's bigger gaps in different areas, those aren't necessarily the targets we'd want to set. It's always good to think about what kind of and we'll talk about this today, but where is your local area, where's your local community that you're hiring from or that you're impacting, and what does the population look like there? Higher as well. So where we're looking at maybe setting targets today, those numbers may need to change in the future as we get more data and better data. And we don't have data on some of the other equity deserving groups. So like persons with disabilities, like 2S LGBTQ plus community, we're not sure in some areas how underrepresented or whatever that those groups might be as well. And sometimes how people define themselves, and when you're filling out surveys or responding to things, how people may feel comfortable responding one week might be different than the next, or how they understand themselves and their own identity may change as well. So we don't want to just ask people once and that's the only time we try to engage them. We want to try to engage people and give them the opportunities to identify more often, and it's really important that we do have that data so we understand where the gaps are and what things need to change. So in the environmental sector too, about 30% of the workforce is expected to retire in the next 10 years. So, you know, what the workforce looks like today and what's going to look like in the future is going to shift as well. And it's not unique to the environmental sector that there's going to be that gap in the labor market. It's happening across many different sectors and industries across Canada. So then how is this sector going to draw them in, you know, compared to another one? And as you heard this morning too from just the panel discussion, going back to some of the things that were raised there, Leslie King was talking about, you know, we need everyone and we need transformation. And I think to help with transformational change, to help address climate change, we need to have more people at the table and more viewpoints and more ideas. So that's really important. And also to address EDI, we need a transformation in how we've done things in the past and how our workforces are structured and how our organizations are structured. So there's another transformation that needs to happen there too. And then Winona was talking about implementing the calls to action and just how far behind, you know, we are in doing that across Canada too. So we need to be doing these things moving forward with truth and reconciliation as well. We don't want to wait till 2080 before we get everything done on that list, because it needs to happen sooner than that. So we're talking about diversity when we talk about representation, but really the levers like we're talking about that we need to adjust are around inclusion and equity. So these are things we can change even if we're not doing a lot of hiring. These are things that we can change in our everyday behaviors by looking at our systems and how our organizations are set up, and these are some things that we can work on changing now. And then just also wanted to point out too, this tool that we've touched on a little bit today is just the Women Reclaiming Leadership tool. There's a bunch of great resources on there on Eco-Canada's website too, that Maureen and I have been a part of the advisory committee for. Maureen Reed at the back, so. Okay.
My turn, thank you. So we've talked about what EDI means. We've talked a little bit about sort of the landscape, the labor market landscape within the particular sector. And then it's really down to, okay, what do we do now? So what do we do next? And again, as Jocelyn mentioned, we really kind of advise a pretty systematic approach. We like to use sort of a strategy as that basis because it can be really difficult to know exactly where to start. So using really solid business strategy functions to build EDI, it also supports kind of that buy-in from the individuals who may not be as supportive about this conversation to put it in a language like any other business function. So it's certainly kind of the way that we commonly sort of approach organizations when we're starting with that, okay, what do we do next? So really using that sort of business strategy approach. And coupling that with advising and coaching in inclusive leadership. So what exactly is inclusive leadership and why would it be important here? I think logically it makes sense. If you want to lead an EDI initiative and you want to have some strong strategy, you're going to need somebody to sort of champion that or somebody's. And certainly having people that have really strong inclusive leadership abilities is going to be critical to moving this thing forward. So inclusive leadership, there's lots of great studies about what it is and what are those traits and characteristics. And it may look a little bit different than sort of maybe more traditional leadership models, but the pieces that are usually included are referenced here. A lot of work out of Harvard actually on this specific topic. And I believe all of these have been quoted in most of their research. But visible commitment, we heard that actually this morning as well, actually in the compliance piece. If you don't have leadership's visible commitment to EDI, it's really hard to advance these things. And so that's a really important piece. Also having that humility, like we are learning all the time, even in the space as consultants where we're asked to advise and coach. Terminology is changing, the landscape is changing, our own understanding of our biases and awareness are constantly changing. So, being comfortable with knowing what you don't know and really kind of coming to those conversations with humility is very helpful. And it really keeps that conversation open. So that's another great piece. Learning about your own bias. So we'll encourage that for everyone today. Learning about what you don't know, understanding yourself and how you show up and kind of engaging in that feedback with others to understand yourself more is really important. So having that awareness of your own biases and your own sort of advantage and privilege, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Having a general curiosity about others is really helpful. So wanting to learn more about people that are perhaps different than you or perceived different than you is really great, because when you're in that space and you're approaching things with curiosity, it really takes a lot of guard down in conversations, right? So I think curiosity can be useful in business in many ways and certainly in innovation, but that's another piece here for inclusivity. Cultural intelligence was also brought up this morning in the panel as sort of a key skill for any environmental professional moving forward, and we see it certainly as part of inclusive leadership as well. So again, that willingness to kind of learn, that willingness to have that awareness around different cultures and different identities is great. And collaboration, I think that's the biggest word I've heard, my bingo words, at the conference. So having that ability to collaborate with others and showing up to the table with a willingness to collaborate is critical. So using a strategic approach to EDI, making it a business strategy so that you get that buy-in, and at the same time leading the initiative with those inclusive leadership traits, you're going to get really far. And back to Jocelyn.
Okay, so where are you starting from? And I think this is a good way for organizations to kind of approach this, is understanding where the challenges are in their organization. So often that's the first step that Courtney and I take with organizations, is just understanding what the status quo is, what's happening within organizations. So we do this by going in and doing interviews or surveys or focus groups. It depends on if it's an outward-facing organization, like a professional regulator or a large association where members are kind of like out in the doing other things with part of other organizations, or is it an employer-based organization where people are maybe internal and we're talking more to employees? But a lot of it is listening at that stage. Some of it is taking a look at policies and programs and asking questions and kind of doing that desktop piece to understand kind of the context of the organization. And then a lot of it is listening to the people within the organization to say, okay, what kind of things are happening in your day-to-day that you're maybe that aren't getting reported, that aren't kind of making their way up to senior leaders, that they don't know what's going on, that we need to try to fix in the organization. And that's really important because when I did my master's work, I asked people about, tell me about a time when you witnessed or experienced discrimination or harassment within your workplace, and I was looking at the mining sector specifically. But what I found out of that in asking people more questions about, what happened afterwards, like did anyone support you, what happened after that bad thing happened, only a little over 20% of those incidents were actually getting formally reported. So if we think about that kind of from, as health and safety is kind of my analogy as an engineer, but I think in terms of like environmental incidents too, if you had only 20% of environmental incidents getting reported within an organization, you'd be like, whoa, shut it down. We need to like reset and stop this. So that was kind of shocking to me that we had that level of underreporting happening. And so why is that underreporting happening? One, maybe because people don't understand and know how to report, or that there are multiple ways to report. Maybe the person who said or did the thing was your supervisor, and you're like, who would I really report to? They're the problem. So sometimes, having multiple avenues is a way to help support that, but if those things aren't getting reported, they don't make their way up to senior leaders, and they don't know that there's even a problem happening. So that's often a lot of what we find, although one of our last clients, we found less of that happening, which we're like, oh, this is great. It's not like that here. That's great. So sometimes we are surprised too, and we see, oh, the culture is actually inclusive and it's working, and there is actually diversity in this organization, and there seems to be, people are having generally a positive experience here. So that was a surprising find for us last time. But usually once we get that information and we provide a lot of recommendations, and then we look at how do we engage leadership. Because oftentimes people who are sitting at that leadership table, they don't have those same experiences where they've experienced discrimination or harassment or some of those bad things that are happening in the organization. They're maybe not having those same day-to-day experiences. So we need to help fill them in on what it's like for other people within the organization. How can they engage in some of these conversations when it's like, oh, I don't know if I'm comfortable talking about gender issues or race issues or different things, like that's not part of who I am. So getting people comfortable talking about things that maybe don't directly impact them, and figuring out what are some of the things that we're gonna go through on the worksheet today to help set those strategies so that we can put those goalposts in and that direction that we want to take the organization to change. Then we get into collaborative solutions. So then going back to the people within the organization, or if it's member-based, going back to members and be like, okay, here's some things we identified we want to change. We want to make sure that we're designing these new policies and systems and programs to meet your needs. So tell us a little bit more about what that looks like for you, and getting people's buy-in and engaging them through the process. And sometimes that's where we would want to do some training too. We start training leaders as we're engaging them. Courtney and I are always putting in little bits of training to get them comfortable with some of these topics and pique their interest around things. But looking at training, the greater organization or the greater membership as we get into those collaborative solutions. And then thinking about monitoring feedback. So how are we going to measure these things? What things are we going to need to be checking and kind of auditing and looking at on a regular basis to know that we're progressing and improving? So when we're thinking about that too, the next piece of it is kind of measuring the impact. And so thinking about that, we're starting from somewhere and we want to get better at what we're doing. So here's some of the ways that we can measure that. So, at the start, maybe there's not really any evidence that we're doing anything. After that, maybe we have a little bit, we're starting on the journey and we have a little bit of focused work in one area, but we're maybe just going to focus on one underrepresented group, or just fixing this one department, or just doing a little bit in one corner somewhere. So that's kind of how we might start out. After that, we want to expand EDI benefits throughout the organization, pick up some speed with that, look at setting some metrics, looking at intersectionality and measuring across different areas, trying to keep more people engaged through the process so that really we get to the point where things are integrated and we're having a bit of a local impact in how the organization is functioning. And then beyond that, really turning into an industry leader and having a larger impact. So then thinking about supply chain and local community and how we have that bigger impact outside of it too. And then the things that we're going to talk about today, and I was wondering if we're going to have some text issues, which we are. Sorry about this. These are the aspects that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with purpose, and then we're going to go to place and kind of go around the circle. So purpose, place, people, performance, and processes are the parts of the framework that we're going to go through today, and we're going to guide you through on the worksheet. And not to say that there's not other things that are important too, but this covers a lot of ground with the things that we want to look at, how we want to look at them, some of the questions that we want to ask within our organizations, some of the actions we maybe want to take to help move forward with these things. Okay, so we're going to start with purpose. And so purpose is about our overarching goal or objective, that thing on the horizon that we're heading off to. This is in Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan. This is my family. A couple years back, it was like 33 degrees that day, and there's no trees. It was very warm, but we did get out on our hike. So we had to think about our intent. We had to think about we were going to climb up kind of our Saskatchewan mountain. We don't really have mountains in Saskatchewan, but it was a very big hill. And we have to think about that we're going to get there and get back and, you know, what we might need along the way. So I want to get a bit of an idea too, before we get into this activity, just kind of who you're working for, what your role might be in your organization, because when I've done this workshop before, some people are like, but I'm like a one-person company, which I'm a one-person company, I understand, and work a lot with other one-person companies like Courtney's. So sometimes when we're thinking about going through these exercises, like, I'm not sure how to answer this. So another option I'm going to give people as we're going through, if you're like, I don't really know how to take this back and think about it, like with being in the role of my organization, you know, wearing that hat on your head. So I want to give you another option, that another hat you can wear as you go through this activity is that of an ally. And so my PhD research is focusing around workplace allyship because I found that oftentimes I was going to talk to conferences and going to a lot of mining conferences or engineering events, you know, where there's only about 15% of the people in those places and spaces are usually women, and somehow I would end up talking to only a group of women, you know, in the rooms I was talking about, the topics I was talking about, and it's like, where are the allies? Where are the men that are, you know we're at this event, but they're not in the room talking about these things. So often the conversation would always switch to that. Well, next year we need to get them in here, and we need to figure out, you know, how to get them engaged. So that's been the focus of my PhD research, is understanding what allyship looks like. And people might use different terms and they might not think about themselves as being an ally, but kind of my working definition around it is allyship is this practice of inclusion. So we're being purposeful in that I want to be inclusive and I want to help support others, and I recognize that I maybe have privilege. So I have some privilege in that I'm a white woman, that I'm cisgendered, that I'm a straight woman in our society, and I have privilege, and there's ways that I can act as an ally for others. And so it's recognizing sometimes that we do have those unearned privileges, and sometimes we can help be a voice, and we can help support, and we can help support those that have been historically marginalized or are still being marginalized, to help them achieve their full potential. So going back to that image that Courtney showed earlier of the bicycle, and thinking about, you know, how do we change the system so that everyone can be successful and get to go on the bike ride if they choose to, you know, in a way that works for them. So that's another hat that you can choose to wear as we go through these exercises, is thinking about, not about how some of these concepts and ideas would benefit your organization, but how they might benefit your career and the impact that you might have through your career in your own professional practice if you act more as an ally for others. So that's kind of the challenge to think about as we're going through all of this. So this first activity is just going to be on your worksheet, and hopefully everyone has a pen with them. If you don't, let us know and we will track some down for you. But the first one is just thinking about purpose. So purpose is coming back to the why. Why are we doing this? Why is EDI important? So if you're doing this with your organizational hat on, why is EDI potentially important to your organization? What are some things that you've maybe heard in your organization? If your organization already has a purpose statement, already has maybe some focus areas, you can put that onto your worksheet. If you want to think about it, though, in terms of your own personal practice, why are you in this room today? Why are you wanting to engage in this conversation? Why is it important to you? Oftentimes, in my research, I've seen that it's because things that have happened to us in the past, because of things that we've witnessed or experienced, or things we've been exposed to, that you're like, I don't want that to be that way for other people, and I want to make a difference. So maybe that is why you're here, and that's why your purpose is. But if you're, maybe I'll just see raise of hands. Who's going to do it with the organizational hat on? We've got a few people. Okay, and who's going to do it with an allyship hat on? Okay, and we're kind of mixed up in different groups, and that's okay. We'll walk around and we'll answer questions. I haven't really thought about how we were going to use the worksheet with an allyship hat on, but happy to answer questions and make sure it works for everyone too. So what we're going to do is give you 5 minutes right now. What do you think, Courtney? Yeah, we'll give you 5 minutes just to write down some ideas around purpose, and then do a quick share at your table just about that purpose ideas you have. And it doesn't have to be like a perfectly curated sentence if you don't have it. Just write down some point form notes, some jot notes, draw a picture, something that speaks to you, and use that to get the conversation started. So we'll give you 5 minutes right now. Okay, so Courtney and I are going to have the unfortunate role of continuing to cut off really good conversation, but we're going to give you a little bit less time on some of these earlier ones, because I think a lot more of what you'll gain out of it is going to come, as we get further into the worksheet too. So hopefully everyone, I walked around and I saw most people had something down, and you were having some discussions around it. So was everyone able to get some sort of an idea down of kind of the why behind your organization, you personally? Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay, I actually think the purpose piece is probably the most difficult. And as we probably work through the other quadrants, you might go back and rework some of the wording there. It might come a little bit clearer. So don't get, as Jocelyn said, don't get hung up on it being that perfectly crafted statement at this point. So the very first sort of quadrant piece that we'll look at is place. And so this one is a really interesting one, because when we think about place and DEI, it can be a little bit hard to put that together, because it seems like it's a person thing that we're talking about, but now we're talking about a space. But certainly the connection starts to build, I think, if we talk about reconciliation, we talk about the lens that our work impacts, and then the communities, of course, that are associated with that. But let's start by thinking about that contextual, that context of place. So when we work with mining companies, when we talk about place in their DEI strategies, we talk about obviously their operations, but we talk about where they're exploring as well. We talk about the impacted communities where their products may move through territories. So thinking about rail, for example, with potash and how that moves from Saskatchewan to the West Coast. So really thinking about your business, thinking about the places that you work, and the different communities that may be impacted. We also think about physical infrastructure when we think about place. And again, forgive me for the mining examples, but that's what they'll be today. But physical infrastructure is really important in DEI. And I will use a mining example because it's really relevant. I'm working with a client right now that has operations in Mexico, and there's a lot of challenges around gender-based violence in the specific region where the mine is located. And so we're looking at physical infrastructure and also the movement of people between sites, between sort of the mine face and also to the plant. And we're looking at roadways where it may not be safe, specifically for women, to move from the end of their shift, for example, to the truck that's going to take them to a road that may not have access or may not have service access, basically, to get them back into town. So thinking about infrastructure and the way, again, that people will move around it, we don't have to get there yet, but there is lots of different risks when we think about DEI that are interrelated. I heard this morning, too, another piece around place is around design, right? So I heard someone mention inclusive design. Obviously, a lot of our work now, and a recent assessment looking at accessibility of building structures and creating more accessible structures. And that can be from a corporate office, again, all the way to a more industrial space, but creating workplaces that are accessible for everyone. So maybe just take a few moments thinking about the places that you work or the work that you are doing impacts, and just jotting a few things down. You'll notice that because it's Jocelyn's beautiful worksheet, there's a Saskatchewan provincial sort of draft there drawing, but you know we can think we can probably it's a perfectly designed province for the work, right? Because it's almost a square. So you know, get creative. You can sort of change the way that looks, but maybe just take a few moments to write down a little bit about the places that your work impacts.
Okay,
Why don't you just go and touch
Okay.
on it, because I forgot the name.
Okay. Okay, so just to draw you back, depending on where you're working across Canada and if that changes too and you're going to a new region that you haven't been in before, native land is a great site as well, just to look to see whose traditional territory that you might be on, or what treaty land you might be on, if you want to look that up as well. But our understanding too of place may shift over time as we get working in different areas and our understanding of it, so something to kind of come back to as well. Okay, next we're going to move on to people. So this is about the people that we impact and that we serve. And so we can maybe narrowly think about people initially as who we might employ, who our coworkers are, who our colleagues are. But as we get further up that measurement scale, we start to think of people more broadly as to who's in our communities, who's in our industry, and kind of the people that we're considering that grows. And shifts. So I just want to touch on some terminology. We'll go through this related to the Federal Employment Equity Act. So how many people are kind of part of federally regulated work in what you do? A few people. So others are, I'm assuming, that are more provincial or territorial. So this may not always apply, but I do see a lot of companies, even if they're not federally regulated, kind of touching to the equity deserving groups outlined in the Federal Employment Equity Act. And so I'll just touch on which groups those are. So these are groups that have been historically and have ongoing marginalization. There's lots of research to kind of describe ways that there's challenges in our society, in our workplaces. So these are groups that we kind of know to have on the radar, that have faced some challenges that we need to keep an eye on. So that's why we're going to touch on them today. So women, kind of a self-explanatory group. We have a lot of women in the room, so we'll get into that too much. Indigenous people in Canada is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Visible minorities, how it's defined in the Employment Equity Act is kind of all non-white, non-Indigenous people. The terminology around that is shifting. It's not the greatest terminology. We would never do a survey or ask people to kind of check a box to say, are you a visible minority? But oftentimes when it gets reported, when we're bringing together that people have maybe told us in different ways what their cultural or ethnic background is, or their race, we may group people together in this aspect. So the federal government was just doing some work around this to kind of see, like, should we update the terminology? Is this the right terminology to use to describe this group? And some of the information that came out of that, other groups that you might see or other ways to describe it is around racialized minorities or racialized people, but there was no kind of consensus coming out of it. I don't know if they're going to shift some of the terminology. In the updated Employment Equity Act that's coming out, Black people in particular are being called out as a separate group. Traditionally there was 4 groups, and so 2S LGBTQ plus has been added as another group, and Black people in particular, just recognizing the additional challenges that those groups face. So persons with disabilities, looking at the data around that and understanding of that, I would say that's continuing to evolve quite a bit in Canada. Traditionally going back decades, maybe we thought about this more as people with physical disabilities, and then there's been more and more work done around neurodiversity and mental health. And so I think the expansion of who might fall into this group and how we define different people in this group and all of the subgroups within it, that is continuing to evolve. So the numbers around that and who might disclose that they are a person with a disability, that may change over time. The terminology around that too. Some people don't like the term person with disability. Some people would like, I've heard that, you can't separate maybe your disability from who you are. So some people like the terminology switch so that it's a disabled person and putting that first because they're saying that that's a core part of their identity. So people may vary in how they want to be described and that type of thing. The 2S LGBTQIA plus community, again, is an umbrella group that brings together people from a lot of different sexual orientations, gender expressions, and brings together a group to build some support around it, where these numbers, if we looked at them, each letter individually, it would maybe be a very small percentage of the Canadian population. And then another group that isn't an equity-deserving group in the Federal Employment Equity Act, but one I'm seeing more and more common, and I think just, as labor issues continue, we don't have a high enough birth rate within Canada, and so newcomers is another group, people moving into our country that do face a lot of challenges, challenges in maybe getting their profession recognized within our country, just the transition of moving to a new country and having to learn a whole new system and culture and everything like that. So there are some unique challenges that newcomers face, and I think that's just another group to be aware of. If your organization is looking to specifically target hiring that group, you maybe need to have different systems and programs to help with those transitions than you would maybe if someone who's been in Canada a long time. So just to get people to get moving around a little bit maybe, I'll get you all to stand up again, and I'm just going to do another quick poll. So who is maybe, if you want to just raise your hand, do a quick stretch. Who is part of a community organization where you're kind of member-focused organization? Do we have anyone like that here? Okay, got a couple people. Okay, so who is primarily part of an employer kind of type organization and kind of here with that? That's the majority of people in the room. Okay, so we'll think about, so everyone can sit down if you want. And then I know some of you are kind of thinking about this with your allyship hat on, as you're thinking about this from your own personal development. Feel free to stretch while you're standing though. Like I said, you can move around. So those that are kind of outward-facing member organizations, when we're going through this activity, think about really reaching out maybe to the people within your member organization. Do you know a lot about them? Are we looking to engage with it? Canadian population, and then we'll have some stats around that. If you're the employer type group, thinking about, do you know much about your employees? HR kind of general questions often are asking people around their age and maybe a binary sex category, sometimes not even going beyond that and kind of thinking of gender more broadly. So sometimes we don't have really great data that we're starting from to kind of know who the people are within our organization, and that's the first step, is just looking to change how we're asking these questions and get some better data. Identity, though, is really a combination of characteristics and attributes. So we can get people to answer some of these questions, but how people may identify and the wording they may use may change over time. So if you can, giving people options, to describe in their own words is always great, because maybe we don't always have the terminology right. But Stats Canada does a lot of work in this area, so usually that's kind of my default to look to see how are they asking these questions. How are maybe groups that support, like 2S LGBTQ+, is there a local pride group? How are they defining things? How are they asking some of the questions? So those are some different ways we can ask. A question that we sometimes get asked is, well, we can't really ask people that, right? Like, we can't ask people their sexual orientation or if they're part of that community. Like, that would be an invasion of privacy. We can't go there. But we can ask those questions. With privacy laws, if we disclose how we're going to collect the data, why we're using the data, how the data is going to be managed, who's going to have access, we can be upfront and transparent in how we're doing these things and why it's important and why we're doing it. People could still choose to not answer. So we may not have everyone disclosing the first time that we ask. We may have to build some trust. If we got everyone answering right away, it's like that would be a really good signal that there's high trust in the organization, which would be awesome. We want to have high trust in these areas, especially when we're asking people private information, things that might not be visible. Some of these groups, it's not necessarily visible if you might belong to one of them. So we can ask these kind of questions, but we need to do so in a respectful manner, and we need to make sure that we're safeguarding that data. We're not just giving everyone access to it, but it is important that we ask it. And as we get into some of the later parts, it's important that we understand it because we can use that in our analysis to know where their gaps are. So that's why it's really important that we're collecting some of that data. So as we get into your worksheet, I want you to think about who you serve or who you impact. And we have a little bit of data on there just in terms of the Canadian population. So we had talked about the first three categories that we have some data on there already on an earlier slide. Persons with disabilities, that number is around 27%. But like I was saying, I think that number is probably just going to increase as people's understanding maybe of disability changes, as people feel more comfortable disclosing those things. So that number is probably going to increase. 2S LGBTQ+ community, Stats Canada has done some data around that. I think we're one of the first countries in the world to kind of try to examine our population and see what that might look like in our population. The overall number that they got within Canada when they kind of asked that question was around 4%. But I put on here 8 to 10% because the younger generation, they're growing up in a much different context maybe than people did in decades past, and their understanding of some of the concepts around gender expression and sexual orientation is much different than previous generations, and so those numbers are higher in younger populations. So I put 8 to 10% because that's probably maybe about what it is. It's just some people may not have had the same openness to be able to answer those questions openly in the past. And so I think that the target needs to be a little bit higher for those populations. So as you're going through this activity, what I want you to do is, not that we would recommend this normally, but just for the sake of this, oh, we do have this slide too, okay. I will touch on this one as well. Okay, before we get into the activity, I want to touch on why we're talking about these things too. So this is the wheel of power and privilege. There's different graphics that kind of describe it. The federal government has some too, and it also includes some other categories. This is not the most inclusive list. There's probably groups on here. I know there's groups on here that are missing. But why this is a really useful tool in a lot of ways, and how I use this when I'm talking about allyship. When we're thinking about privilege, sometimes that can be a really triggering thing for people, and they can get really defensive about it because they think, well, that means I haven't worked hard in some area of my life, that I have some unearned advantage. And that's more than we have time to go through in this workshop right now to think about all of those pieces. If this is something you haven't done a lot of thinking on, maybe write down the word power privilege wheel and come back to it later. But why I want to touch on it for this, and specifically thinking about allyship. So like I mentioned earlier, there's some times where there might be some people that have more power or privilege that their voices are going to get heard more than those that are more marginalized. So how it's helpful as an allyship tool is I can look at this and I can identify some areas where I may be marginalized, and I can identify some areas where I maybe have aspects of my identity that are privileged. And then I can look to see the outside of the circle where it's more marginalized aspects of identity, and I can identify areas where I need to do some growing and learning in under my own understanding so that I know how I can be a better ally for people that may be more marginalized than me. And some of these areas, when we get into looking at power and privilege and thinking about these things, some of these things are, we can change throughout our lifetime, education being one. We can go and get more education maybe, and we can change where we sit on this scale. And some things we're born with, and they don't really change very much. So, what else have I missed about this, Courtney?
Can I add?
Yeah.
And I think you sort of touched on it early, but just to note that this particular representation is very much sort of a Western Canadian context of this wheel. I've seen it drawn differently in like a South American context. So yeah, just keeping in mind that these things can look different depending on the regional communities. But typically, I think if we're just speaking of kind of today in Calgary, talking about business, I think this is a pretty comfortable wheel to use. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of equity, diversity, inclusion is contextual to the place, to the spaces that we're in, to how the policies and the laws have been constructed in our country. So, you know, who has more power, how things are different, who's benefiting, that looks different from place to place. So that's why that place piece is where we started. Okay, so coming back to the activity. So what I want you to do is if you know some of the data within your organization and you have an idea of where some of those gaps are, you can fill it in. If you don't, add a question mark, and maybe that's some questions to go back and ask your organization when you go back to work next week. But otherwise, do some brainstorming about who you serve and who you impact. And where we want you to leave this activity is that you can identify at least one group that you think maybe is underrepresented, underserved, maybe not having the same great experience that everyone else is within the organization, a group that we're going to focus on the next two parts. So that's where I want you to kind of get to. And so we'll give you, again, about 5 minutes on this one, and just share within your table of what group you want to focus on. And not that we recommend only focusing on one group normally, but for the purpose of this exercise, we're just going to focus on one per organization. Or if you're wearing it with the allyship hat, what's a group maybe from that previous slide that you're like, I don't really know exactly what their challenges are. That's a group that I want to do some more work and learning on, and then we can help out with maybe some resources. So. Okay, I'm going to draw everyone back for a minute, and then we're going to take a break, just because we're about the halfway mark or a little bit further than that. And so just want to get a quick show of hands, and then we'll do a Mentimeter, and then we'll have a quick break. Just who has really great data? As we are going through this, you're like, oh yeah, I could fill in all of these. Who has like really great data? You know it all. One person, 2 people maybe. Okay, so, a couple at the back. Okay, so we got a few people, but as you can see, not everyone does. So if you're like, oh, I don't know the answer to these questions, I don't have great data, you are not alone. A lot of organizations don't know, either if they're outward facing and who their members are, or if they're inward facing and an employer kind of relationship. There's not a lot of great data out there, and people don't know, mostly because they haven't asked. And sometimes it does take asking a few times and giving different ways for people to opt in and say who they are and how they identify and what terminology they use. So it does take a while to build up some of these data sources. And so I'll hand over to Courtney just to talk about the Mentimeter.
So this is it's like a very meta experience, right? We're going to experience what it's like to answer an identity question in the room together. And so this is more of something where I'd like you just to be kind of aware of the question and how you're feeling when you're answering the question. Because as Jocelyn was mentioning, not a lot of companies are gathering this data, and often it's because there really isn't likely the trust there for that data even to be good at this point, right? So we've worked with organizations that struggle with some of the identity questions because it may not be safe to ask about certain identity factors in certain regions of the world. So, having to target some of these questions differently. But we'll just explore this together. So if we want to go over to the Mentimeter. Oh, yeah, thank you. That's great. Okay, so if anyone hasn't used the Mentimeter yet, if you want to use the QR code here, just on your phone or tablet, if you have a device with you, and if not, just sit and follow along, you can access the Mentimeter site. And from there, we're going to show some questions. This is entirely anonymous, so we will not be able to tell who is answering the Mentimeter questions, nor will the audience, but giving you a chance to answer a very simple, oops, oh no, we've gone to the end of the presentation. We'll just wait here. Can we go back to are you doing it? Who's doing it? Okay, perfect. Yeah, let's pause here. Awesome, thank you. Again, the technology nightmares. Okay, so yeah, we're back to the question here. So it's how do you identify? And again, we've only included some identifying factors here. This is not all of them, but this is kind of a light example of what an organization may ask if they're starting to gather some of that self-identification data for the first time. It's really more about, as Jocelyn mentioned, it's setting the parameters for how the data is going to be used and stored is really more of the issue. Because remember that all of these things people can opt out of, right? We can ask, but we're not forcing anyone to respond to this. So that's where you get into trouble. As long as it's sort of we're doing this to help identify as part of our diversity inclusion efforts, which groups exist in our organization and where some of those gaps are. We're going to use X data to do this. We're going to store data in this way and providing that disclosure and transparency, then you're fine. But obviously, as part of our disclaimer, it's always that this is a participatory process. It's voluntary. There's no punitive piece to you participating or not participating in this kind of a survey. But similar to engagements, I'm sure a lot of you have done engagement surveys in your organization, so sort of check-in and employee experience surveys. It would be presented in a similar manner to that. So we want this data, we're hoping you'll participate, we're going to use it in this way. This is our intention, but of course, it's not mandatory for anyone to complete. Great, so we've got, a little bit of diversity showing kind of in the room here around identity factors, but again, more than the data, I think it's just interesting to kind of reflect on how that feels to be asked those things and then to answer them and to be comfortable with certain areas of disclosure and not. And again, as Jocelyn was mentioning, certainly particular aspects of identity that we've mentioned here, disability specifically, that's evolving and changing all the time as different levels of awareness kind of show up. So we'll see kind of changes in that data, and it speaks to having an important piece is to ask this more than once and to give people an opportunity to disclose at more than one time. So it would be something maybe you'd ask as part of an orientation, but you would also provide them access, really sort of strong self-identification systems, provide an opportunity for employees to go in, much like their personal file, and change that information whenever they want. So if they want to change how their gender expression is shared, they want to change disability status, they can do that at any time. So that's probably the most kind of robust systems that we see. But again, if you're not collecting that data, that's okay. That's the majority of folks and organizations right now. Okay, and then the next question, which I think you can flip to, maybe everyone's gone to it already. So this is, again, a bit more of an external reflection. based on your own perspective, so keeping that in mind. So what are you observing? What are you sensing in your own organizations? Which equity-deserving groups experience barriers within the environmental profession? So again, thinking internally in your organization, who you work with, but also perhaps broadly, if you're engaged with other environmental professionals, what are you kind of seeing in the landscape right now? Sort of who's experiencing some of those challenges? And so all of these questions are really helpful in kind of one, understanding our own awareness, but also leading us to strategy, right? So if we're getting to a space where we're identifying specific groups or identity factors that are facing barriers, we're reinforcing that with perhaps with some of that self-identification data. We're starting to put some of these pieces together to understand those gaps a little bit more fulsomely. Okay, that was the fun part of the experiment. Switch it back.
Okay, so I said we would take a break around now too, so I'm thinking that we'll maybe take a 5-minute break, or do people need a 10-minute break? 5-minute break, I heard? Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break right now, and so go get some more tea, coffee, whatever you need to do, and we'll meet back here in 5 minutes. No, just do it. Yeah. Oh. It moves both of them when I.
Okay.
So it moved the slides, but it also moved. Yeah.
Can we flip it to the other one? Yeah.
Okay, we'll get started in just a minute here.
Yeah, me. Thank you. Okay, we're going to jump right back in, and we actually anticipate we'll be done a little bit early, so we'll kind of move through the next two quadrants and have a little bit of time for discussion at our tables again. But certainly I know you're probably getting the hang of the workshop now and certainly the worksheet, so we should be able to move nice and quickly. So we wanted to touch on the next piece of the quadrant, so that's the process. And when we're thinking about process and perhaps more broadly, some of the policies or programs or initiatives that we could potentially start, it becomes sort of the action piece, the more tangible piece within the strategy. So for those of you that have kind of moved through those other pieces, thinking about what kind of programs, policies, or initiatives would make some impact on the folks that you've identified. So again, we've talked about to simplify in the workshop today. We're looking at sort of one identified group that you wanted to focus your efforts on. So thinking about the types of policies or programs that might support that group. So there's lots of examples here, and we'll share maybe a few just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. Often in organizations, when we're thinking about gender, one of the first things we talk about is sort of what is the supports around parental leave. We had a lot of conversation about that this morning in one of the chats as well. So thinking about what the current parental leave programs or policies are, and are they adequate, and are they serving everybody? So that's sort of one potential program or initiative. Also pay equity audits. This is another piece, certainly around gender, but we're also seeing organizations touch on this with other underrepresented groups. So taking a look at the way that we pay people, the way that we compensate people, and noting if there is some gaps, some equity gaps within the way that compensation occurs. So that's another potential initiative or program is conducting some form of a pay equity audit. We also look at some of those perhaps more career building, perhaps outward facing opportunity programs, things like mentorship or sponsorship programs, where we try to expand maybe the current pipeline of our chosen identity group by encouraging some of those supports, those sort of relationship and team supports that help bring people along and help retain the staff that we have. So again, mentorship has proven to be very successful for that. that, and internally in organization sponsorship, where we have a senior leader perhaps who advocates for someone who's more junior, brings them along, provides them with some opportunities for learning, development, and access within an organization with the intention of building kind of their career over time. So that's another sort of potential program or initiative you could select. Also lots of work around awareness building campaigns. And certainly for Jocelyn and I, we worked with different associations and thinking about even for Eco Canada now, how do we bring more people into the tent, if you would? How do we bring people towards the careers and towards the industry? And can we do that in a way that builds awareness, that showcases the diversity that we have, acknowledges the gaps that are there, but also create spaces for new and different groups to join. So awareness campaigns can be really fabulous for that. It also helps to build the pipeline in a more long-term approach. So I was speaking to one of the individuals in the room about kind of like, how do we expand that pipeline? If we're just not finding diversity in our current recruitment efforts, what do we do? Like, we put out an ad and we get the same types of folks applying. And so this is more of a long-term kind of approach. It doesn't solve it overnight, but the idea of employers having some responsibility about expanding that pipeline over time, I think is a really great one. So how do we get out into the community? How do we go into classrooms and talk to young kids about opportunities in engineering and environmental profession, all of these spaces we're in, and show that that's a space for everybody, show that that's a space for Indigenous kids and women and girls, and really bring people into, again, the profession in a long-term approach. So I think there's lots of room for employers to get more involved in that sort of work, that kind of community engagement. So that might be the type of thing you want to choose as your program or initiative, engaging with those community organizations or schools and doing some of that supportive work over the long term. And then kind of the bread and butter for us, like the EDI training, the development kind of within the organization. So can we bring some of that awareness into organizations through training initiatives, through targeted training initiatives on certain topics or around certain issues that we know kind of our focused identity group is facing? And can we bring some of that awareness? Seeing a lot of work in this space, certainly around truth and reconciliation. So, lots of organizations that are doing a lot of work around awareness when it comes to reconciliation, and really kind of building that knowledge within their organization first, noting that there's that gap, right? That historical learnings, certainly in Canadian education, we didn't receive those trainings and learnings. So employers are stepping up to provide those kind of learning opportunities for their employees. Flexible workplace practices. How many people have some sort of flexible workplace policy, procedure? That's great. And I think if we asked that like 3 years ago, there'd be maybe a quarter of the people would have said that. So that's really nice to see. I think Jocelyn will agree with me when I would say flexible workplace practices are probably the most inclusive thing that any organization can do. You can bring more groups of people into the workforce and keep them there and have them thrive by addressing kind of inflexibility. So, it's a major advantage for basically every kind of employee, and certainly removes barriers for those that have been sort of classically underrepresented or underserved. So that may be an initiative you want to explore. Positive reporting culture is another one that we're seeing a lot more. So Jocelyn spoke to her research efforts and certainly some work we've done with some clients around disclosure and discrimination, harassment incidents. So really building in some training, some systems around reporting that takes away some of that stigma around reporting and around kind of managing incidents and turns it into a positive reporting culture. So we see this again compared to sort of health and safety reporting, that it's not the type of we don't want a type of organization where we don't report health and safety incidents. We want to report everything and we'll deal with it. And it's not a problem, it's a thing that we're gonna work on, and we're gonna work on this together. So it's using that same kind of structure around discrimination and harassment. And that's growing. I don't think it's particularly great in most Canadian contexts, but certainly some organizations are leading the way there. So yeah, lots of different things that you could, and that's just some. Those are just ideas around initiatives or programs, but maybe take a moment to sort of jot down what would be sort of your process, initiative, policy change, when you're thinking about sort of your specified group, and just sort of take a minute at your table to do that. And I guess, yeah, we'll leave the last two columns for now because we'll kind of get to that. So maybe we'll take a few minutes and just share at your table. You can work and share at the same time, I think, for this one, and maybe just talk through some of your ideas. I just want to share. Yeah.
Okay, for those that are wearing the allyship hat, I've been trying to think about how we can get you involved with this too. I think what you might want to do here is okay, so if, say, in your previous thing, you identified maybe you want to support more Indigenous people within the environmental sector, think about what kind of programs you might want to look for so that you can get more involved. So maybe, is there a mentorship program that you want to sign up for, maybe to be a mentor to help someone out? Do you want to join a committee to help support others? So brainstorm some ideas if you're wearing that allyship hat of what kind of programs or policies you might need to go back and Google when you get back to work next week about how you can get involved. Okay, I'm going to pull everyone back, and we're going to talk about kind of wrapping things up. And again, I'm sorry about the font on here. It got changed a few times. Oh, do we have a Mentimeter too?
I think at the very end.
At the very end? Okay. Okay, so we've went through this whole framework. We started off, and Courtney had mentioned too that we might want to go back and you might want to look at that purpose statement, and whether you have the energy and you're feeling motivated to look at it now or you want to look at it next week, totally up to you. But maybe you do want to go back and do some more wordsmithing now that you've had time to kind of think about all of these concepts, or maybe you come back and revisit in a few months when you've done some more learning or had some more discussions with others in your organization too. So we've kind of worked around and we've talked about place, people, performance, processes. We were just having a conversation at one of the tables too, just about sometimes things get rolled out from corporate and it's it doesn't really land well maybe in the local context. So if you're an organization, you have multiple sites across the country or around the globe, again, coming back to place, who your local population is maybe different in a downtown corporate setting than what it is in a remote northern community. And so what representation looks like there, what inclusion practices you need, what policies and programs you need are maybe different in different situations. So something to keep in mind if you're someone who's wearing that organizational hat and coming from corporate, you maybe need to get out to the sites or make sure that you're not handcuffing people in any sort of way with the things that are being rolled out, that it actually works for the groups that we're trying to support. So as we talked about in the accountability process too, we want to define the problem, we want to engage leaders, we want to develop collaborative solutions, and we want to be able to measure these things. And you can take that same approach if you're coming at it with an allyship perspective as well. Do you understand the challenges that some of the underrepresented groups within Canada are facing? If not, areas to do some more learning around? Do you feel comfortable talking with others about some of these topics? If not, again, maybe do some more learning, maybe reaching out to people who are part of those underserved groups and having some conversations around them and just practicing getting more comfortable with it. Being collaborative and coming up with solutions. So a lot of learning and growth and development in these areas, it is not done by one person sitting at a desk by themselves with a closed door. These things need to be done collaboratively. So even if you're approaching it with an allyship lens, a lot of learning can happen within communities of other learners. So if there's an area that you want to do some more growing and learning in, maybe it's going back to your organization and being like, hey, I think I need to do some work in this. Are you interested too? Let's form maybe a book club, a podcast club. Let's get together once a month for lunch and let's talk about these topics and let's get better at this stuff. So that could even be an option. And then measurement too. Whether it's for your organization or for yourself personally, set some goals. So maybe, here's 5 books I'm going to read this year to kind of expand my knowledge and understanding around these things. Here's a different conference or conversation I'm going to have, to expand my knowledge and understanding. And then organizationally, going back and just looking, what data do we have available? Oh, we don't have good data. How can we change that? How can we change our systems so that we can get some better data and know where our problems are, where we're falling short and leaving people behind? Okay. So we talked about measurement in these different ways too. So recognizing as you go back and you engage with others too, because that was one of the things earlier on that people had said, I want to know how to have conversations with people about this stuff sometimes, how to bring back this strategy discussion. Just keep in mind, you just spent through a few hours of workshop on this and the people in your office maybe haven't. And so their understanding about some of these topics might not be quite where yours are. They might be starting lower on the scale than where you're at. So think about how can you bring others up to speed? How can you engage them in it? There's lots of good videos and resources and different things, some of them on the Eco Canada website too, that you can use to help spark some of those conversations. So if you're used to doing kind of like value share type things to start a meeting, or having land acknowledgements, or talking about an environmental incident or health and safety incident or something to spark a conversation at the start of a meeting, start sneaking in some EDI type topics too is another way to do that. So think about how can we, individually as an organization, collectively, how can we kind of move up this scale? How can we go from like not really understanding this stuff, not feeling comfortable having conversations and engaging in it, to being at a place where we're really leaders in this area, where we're being more inclusive, purposely inclusive, where we have equitable systems, where we can see diversity changing representation within our organizations. So a couple last steps before we get into this Mentimeter. Just on your worksheet, if you haven't already, write down your next steps. So when you go back to the office next week, what's one thing that you want to do differently? What's one conversation you want to have? What's one question you want to ask? What's one goal you want to set? Maybe something that you're going to go back and even have some accountability around. Tell maybe your leader, tell some of your peers that you work with, what's something that you want to be held accountable to. So just take a minute to do that, and then we're going to get into Mentimeter one more time.
That's great. And in many ways, I think the Mentimeter question is similar to what we're asking kind of individually, but it might be nice to kind of look at that together and sort of share what our next steps are collectively. Thank you. So yeah, the last Mentimeter, let me know if you're having trouble accessing again, just throw your hand up, we'll come and give you a hand. So really again, just sort of what actions can you take to advance your own development within EDI or within DEI in 2024? And it's again sort of holding ourselves accountable to setting a bit of a goal, whether we've had the allyship hat on today or not. If we are just looking at our organizations, it's still really beneficial for us to think about our own development and growth. And as Jocelyn and I have both talked about, this space is changing and growing and changing all the time. So, we can't really stay stagnant in our learning. We've got to sort of keep growing. So great to kind of set some of those targets for yourself. So I'm seeing some different things. I love this sort of pay more attention and remain empathetic. That's sort of being really conscious in those conversations that we're having and those dialogues that we're having is so beneficial. Again, seeing the word dialogue popping up here, engaging more within the EDI groups that maybe already exist, so they could exist in your organization or outside, but ways to kind of reconnect. Thinking about mentorship as well as a model for new hires, I like that. Again, we've got lots of good evidence that mentorship is really effective for engaging diversity and creating sort of more inclusive spaces. So definitely that's a one we'll encourage. Be curious and creating a welcome and safe, I'm going to say environment's probably under there, and mindful of our biases. So again, just really kind of that self-reflection and noting kind of where we're at in conversations can really change things quite dramatically from a small space. The other thing I heard in the room today is an interest in, and bring back to one of the first questions, is having a bit more knowledge around and being able to have those conversations with like the business case for DEI, if you would, or the reasons why this is important. And certainly we can share with you some resources. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to get in touch with everybody yet, but we'll be here tomorrow. But we've got some great links for some of those sort of stronger hitting research reports that might particularly be relevant for certain voices or groups within your organization. So if you need that, we can give you some support there. Yeah, seeing what else I can see here. Yeah, I think just sort of the general theme really of being mindful in our conversations, and it's quite amazing what that can do when we do it. So that's great. Thank you very much for sharing all of that.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to touch on a couple things too. So check out the Reclaiming Leadership Toolkit. It has some of the business case stuff on it on the Eco Canada website too. So there's some really great resources there. And I was at a conference in Toronto around unconscious bias and how to overcome that. So I just want to touch briefly on this. There was a big 7-year conglomeration study called Engendering Success in STEM that was done, and they were looking at STEM fields just because there is and gender because women tend to be underrepresented in those fields. And so they did a whole host of really interesting research, kind of starting from children all the way up into the workforce and looking at different ways and how can we intervene and what things can we do different. And bias is a really tricky one because bias is just like our preference for one thing over another. So even just an easy example is just like the lunch buffet earlier, did you gravitate towards one thing over the other? That's just probably because of what you're used to growing up. So it's really hard to change biases, but one thing that we can do is just become aware of it. We can start talking about these things. We can start noticing them. We can increase our awareness. And then sometimes we just need to pause and breathe before we act. So rather than switching into like auto mode with everything, biases keep us safe and they protect us, from lions attacking us and saber-toothed tigers and whatever. But we sometimes need to pause those biases and just recognize that we have them, not feel shameful or guilty about them, but just, okay, why did I have that thought? Where is that coming from? And, I'm going to choose to do something differently than what my brain automatically told me to do. But you've been programmed your whole life to kind of have those reactions, so it's not an easy thing to overcome, and we're not always aware where we have biases, and they're ingrained and they're built into many of our systems, so we may not even notice them a lot of the time. So it's a really tricky thing, but in being purposeful and having EDI strategies and starting to look at the data, we can be like, oh, I see that there's differences here. There's differences here that shouldn't be here that, are harming one group more than another, and we need to change something around it. And we can build systems and we can change them so that people maybe don't have those opportunities to inject their bias into them. So hiring is a really good one. We can take a more systematic approach around it so that it's not just about hiring someone who already looks like me to come work in this organization. It's about being purposeful and looking at things through a different lens. So just one thing around biases there. But just to wrap up, and we can just go back to the slides. We were going to give people time just to talk about intention. Maybe I will just wrap up and then I will leave you time to talk about intention. So just to wrap up, thank you all for joining us today and engaging in the conversation. And I hope you going back to your organization or going back to your workplace next week and you have some ideas of some things that you can do differently, some questions you can ask, some things you want to do some learning about. We do this type of work and we help support organizations because not everyone has spent a lot of time thinking and learning about it like Courtney and I have and working in different organizations. So if you need help with some of these things, with doing those assessments, with helping to elevate voices and experiences within your organizations, that's an area that we can help out and we can help bring our skills to you. So please feel free to reach out to us and follow us on LinkedIn. We try to share information that hopefully helps people along on their journeys around allyship and around understanding equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. And we'll stick around for questions too if you have any questions. But just if you want to have more discussion at your table, talk about those intentions you set. If you feel like you didn't get all your questions answered, stick around and we can come answer your questions. So.